Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling accounts recorded in the history of the American presidency. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. In the manuscript division of the Library of Congress, filed among thousands of documents related to Abraham Lincoln's presidency, there exists a series of letters that historians did not begin to fully analyze until the 1960s. These letters, written in careful script on plain paper, are signed with initials rather than full names, and they address topics ranging from military strategy to political maneuvering to assessments of public sentiment in the border states. For decades, scholars assumed these letters were from one of Lincoln's many white advisors. Then, in 1967, a researcher named Dr. Margaret Foster made a discovery that would transform understanding of Lincoln's presidency. The letters were written by a formerly enslaved man named William Slade, who served as Lincoln's valet, but who functioned in ways that remained carefully concealed during his lifetime, as one of the president's most trusted advisors on matters related to slavery, race, and the political complexities of emancipation. William Slade was born in approximately 1815 in Culpeper County, Virginia, though the exact date is not recorded in any surviving document. The first mention of him appears in the estate records of a planter named Robert Slade, who died in 1820. The inventory of Robert Slade's property includes one Negro boy, approximately 5 years, named William, valued at $150. This single line establishes that William was enslaved from birth, that he was the property of the Slade family, and that even as a small child, he was assigned monetary value as an asset to be transferred with the rest of the estate. Following Robert Slade's death, his widow Elizabeth maintained the plantation with the help of an overseer, and William grew up among the approximately 30 enslaved people who worked the property. According to fragmentary records and later testimonies, William displayed unusual intelligence from an early age. A letter written in 1828 by Elizabeth Slade to her brother in Richmond mentions, "The boy William, now about 13 years, has learned letters and numbers somehow, though I certainly did not teach him. He assists in the household and performs his duties capably. I confess I find his alertness both useful and slightly unsettling." The fact that William had learned to read and write while enslaved in Virginia, where such education was explicitly illegal, suggests either that someone taught him secretly or that he taught himself through observation and persistence. Literacy among enslaved people was rare and dangerous. Those caught with books or writing materials faced severe punishment. Yet literacy was also profoundly valuable, opening access to information and ideas beyond the narrow confines masters wanted enslaved people to inhabit. In 1830, when William was approximately 15 years old, Elizabeth Slade made a decision that would alter his trajectory. She was aging, her health declining, and she wished to settle her affairs. She manumitted William, granting him legal freedom, apparently in recognition of his service and perhaps in acknowledgement of his abilities. The manumission document, filed with the Culpeper County Clerk on August 3, 1830, states, "I, Elizabeth Slade, do hereby grant freedom to my Negro man William, approximately 15 years of age, in consideration of faithful service and good character. Said William is hereafter free and at liberty to go where he pleases." Manumission was becoming increasingly difficult in Virginia by 1830, as laws tightened in response to fears of slave rebellion following Nat Turner's 1831 uprising. Elizabeth Slade's act of freeing William came just before these restrictions intensified. However, freedom for a black person in Virginia remained precarious and constrained. Free black people had to register with authorities, carry papers proving their status at all times, faced restrictions on movement and economic activity, and lived under constant threat of being kidnapped and sold into slavery, particularly if they traveled where their free status was not known. William left Virginia shortly after gaining freedom, moving north to Washington, D.C., where a substantial free black community existed. According to city directory listings, by 1832 he was working as a waiter in a hotel, one of the few occupations reliably available to free black men. The work was service labor, socially denigrated, but it provided income and, importantly, it placed him in proximity to influential people whose conversations he could overhear and from whose presence he could learn about politics and power. A diary entry from a Washington resident named Charles Wainwright, dated April 1835, mentions an encounter with William. Dined at the National Hotel today. The Negro waiter who served our table was remarkably attentive and intelligent. When I inquired about his background, he explained he was from Virginia, freed by his mistress, and had come to Washington seeking opportunity. His manner was dignified, his English well-spoken. I found myself wondering what such a person might accomplish if society permitted him the same opportunities as white men. Throughout the 1830s, William worked in Washington's service industry while educating himself further. He attended evening classes offered by free black churches, where he improved his reading and writing. He read newspapers voraciously, following political developments with keen interest. He observed the operations of government, as Washington's hotels and restaurants served congressmen, senators, and government officials, whose conversations about national affairs William heard while serving their meals. By 1840, William had moved into employment as a personal servant to a congressman from Massachusetts, a position that brought him into closer proximity to political power. Over the following years, he worked for several different officials, gaining a reputation for discretion, capability, and reliability. These qualities, combined with his intelligence and his careful observation of political dynamics, made him increasingly valuable to those who employed him. In 1849, William entered the employment of the White House, initially as a messenger and then as a servant in the domestic staff. He was one of several free black people who worked in the White House in various service capacities. The White House domestic staff operated in the background, unseen by most visitors, essential to the functioning of the residence, but socially invisible. For someone like William, this invisibility was both limitation and opportunity. Limited because his contributions went unrecognized. Opportunity because invisibility meant he could observe and hear things that were not guarded in his presence. William worked in the White House through the presidencies of Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. During these years, he observed the increasing sectional tensions over slavery, the compromises that temporarily eased but ultimately failed to resolve these tensions, and the gradual movement toward the crisis that would culminate in civil war. A letter written by William to a friend in Philadelphia, dated November 1856, reveals his political awareness and his frustration with the moral failures of the political leadership he observed. "I work daily in the house where the nation's business is conducted, and I see clearly that our leaders lack the courage to confront the fundamental evil that divides us. They speak of compromise and moderation, but what compromise is possible between freedom and slavery? What moderation can reconcile justice with oppression? I believe a reckoning is coming, and I pray that when it comes, leaders will emerge who possess both the moral clarity and the political skill to navigate the crisis." The reckoning William anticipated arrived sooner than anyone expected. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 prompted Southern states to secede, and by the time Lincoln took office in March 1861, 7 states had left the Union and formed the Confederacy. The outbreak of war at Fort Sumter in April 1861 confirmed that the sectional conflict would be resolved through violence. Lincoln arrived in Washington with limited knowledge of the city and limited personal staff. He brought with him from Illinois his secretaries John Nicolay and John Hay, but he needed to rely on existing White House staff for many functions. William Slade, who had worked in the White House for more than a decade, was among those who remained to serve the new president. Initially, William's role was conventional. He served as valet, managing Lincoln's clothing, helping him dress, maintaining his quarters, and performing various personal services. Lincoln, who was notably informal and uninterested in social pretensions, treated his servants with courtesy that was unusual for the era. He spoke with them as human beings rather than as invisible functionaries. He asked questions and listened to answers. A diary entry from John Hay, dated May 1861, provides an early indication of Lincoln's relationship with William. The president has developed the habit of conversing with his valet Slade while dressing in the morning. I overheard part of their discussion today. They were talking about whether the border states would remain in the Union. Slade was offering his assessment of sentiment among colored people in Maryland. The president listened attentively and asked follow-up questions. I was struck by the seriousness with which he treated Slade's opinions. This pattern, Lincoln seeking William's perspective, and William offering carefully considered analysis, developed gradually over the first months of Lincoln's presidency. Lincoln recognized that William possessed knowledge that his white advisors lacked: direct understanding of black communities, personal experience of the slavery system, and insight into how enslaved and free black people were interpreting the war and its implications for their future. As the war progressed and the question of emancipation became increasingly pressing, Lincoln relied more heavily on William's counsel. The political complexities were immense. Lincoln personally opposed slavery, but he was president of a union that included slaveholding border states whose loyalty was essential to winning the war. He had to balance moral conviction with political calculation, humanitarian concerns with military strategy, long-term goals with immediate necessities. William's role evolved from simply answering questions Lincoln posed to actively offering analysis and recommendations. A letter from William to a friend in Boston, dated August 1862, describes this development. I find myself in an extraordinary position. The president seeks my views on matters of the highest importance. He asks how enslaved people will respond to various policies, whether free black communities will support particular measures, how emancipation might be implemented effectively. I offer my honest opinions, though I am careful to note when I am speculating versus when I have direct knowledge. He weighs my counsel alongside that of his official advisers, and I have seen instances where my perspective influenced his decisions. The extraordinary nature of this relationship cannot be overstated. Here was the President of the United States, facing the greatest crisis in the nation's history, regularly consulting with a formerly enslaved black man whose official position was valet. The arrangement violated every social norm of the era. If it had been publicly known, it would have been scandalous, not because anyone could question William's intelligence or insight, but because the racial hierarchies of the time dictated that black people, regardless of ability, should not influence white people, especially not the most powerful white person in the nation. Both Lincoln and William understood the need for discretion. Their substantive conversations occurred in private, often early in the morning when Lincoln was dressing or late at night when he was preparing for bed. To observers, it appeared that Lincoln was simply being characteristically informal, chatting with his servant as he did with many people. The depth and significance of these conversations remained hidden. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in preliminary form in September 1862 and final form in January 1863, reflected input from many sources. Lincoln consulted his cabinet, military advisers, political allies, and various other counselors. He also consulted William Slade, though this consultation left no official record and remained unknown to most of Lincoln's contemporaries. A letter from William, written in January 1863 to Frederick Douglass, with whom William had begun corresponding, describes his involvement. You ask whether I had any influence on the proclamation. I can say that the President sought my views on several matters related to it. He asked whether enslaved people would understand the proclamation's limitations, that it freed enslaved people only in rebel territory, not in border states or areas under Union control. I told him that enslaved people would understand the practical limitations, but would also grasp the larger significance, that the United States government was officially declaring slavery wrong and was committed to its destruction where federal power could reach. He asked whether free black communities would support the enlistment of colored troops. I assured him they would, eagerly, as military service would demonstrate capacity and earn claims to citizenship. He listened carefully and seemed to incorporate these perspectives into his thinking. The Emancipation Proclamation transformed the war from a conflict over union versus disunion into a struggle over slavery versus freedom. It also made possible the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. Lincoln initially had reservations about arming black men, fearing it would alienate border states and white Northern opinion. William was among those who convinced him that black troops would fight effectively and that their service would strengthen both the war effort and the moral case for emancipation. As black regiments formed throughout 1863, Lincoln sought regular updates from William about their reception in black communities and about the experiences of black soldiers. William, in turn, maintained correspondence with black leaders and soldiers, gathering information that he synthesized for Lincoln's benefit. A memorandum from Lincoln to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, dated July 1863, states, "I have received information from sources I trust that our colored troops are performing admirably, and that recruitment could be expanded significantly if we address concerns about pay equality and protection from enslavement if captured. I recommend we consider these issues urgently." The sources I trust almost certainly included William Slade, though Lincoln could not identify him explicitly in official communications. William's influence extended beyond slavery and emancipation to broader questions of war strategy and politics. He provided Lincoln with intelligence about border state sentiment, gathered from his own observations and from correspondence with black communities in Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. He offered perspectives on how various policies would be perceived by different constituencies. He served as a sounding board for Lincoln's ideas, asking questions and raising concerns that helped Lincoln refine his thinking. John Hay's diary contains several passages that, read carefully, suggest awareness of William's role, even if Hay did not fully understand its extent. An entry from March 1864 states, "The President spent an hour this morning in conversation with Slade before his cabinet meeting. When he emerged, he seemed to have clarified his thinking on the question of black suffrage. I wonder sometimes whether Slade's influence is greater than appearances suggest. The question of black suffrage, whether black men should have the right to vote, became increasingly pressing as Union victory seemed more likely and Reconstruction planning intensified. Lincoln's position evolved from opposing black suffrage entirely to supporting limited suffrage for educated black men and black veterans. William was instrumental in this evolution. A letter from William to Frederick Douglass, dated November 1864, describes a conversation with Lincoln. "I spoke with the President yesterday about suffrage. I argued that military service earns citizenship rights, that black soldiers who risk their lives for the Union deserve the vote. I also argued that education demonstrates capacity and that educated colored men should not be denied suffrage while ignorant whites possess it." He listened thoughtfully. He said he was inclined to support limited suffrage as a starting point, though he feared broader suffrage would alienate too many whites and jeopardize other Reconstruction goals. I pressed him to consider that partial suffrage, while imperfect, would establish the principle and create momentum for expansion. He seemed to find this reasoning persuasive. Lincoln's last public speech, delivered on April 11, 1865, just days before his assassination, included support for limited black suffrage in Louisiana. This was the first time a president publicly endorsed any form of black political rights. The speech outraged white supremacists, including John Wilkes Booth, who was in the audience and who would murder Lincoln 3 days later. William Slade was with Lincoln on the evening of April 14, 1865. He helped the president dress for the theater, and according to some accounts, he had misgivings about Lincoln attending that night. He later testified that Lincoln seemed tired and distracted, and that he wished the president would stay home and rest. But Lincoln felt obligated to attend, as his presence had been advertised, and he believed his appearance would boost public morale in the wake of the war's end. When word reached the White House that Lincoln had been shot, William rushed to the Peterson House, where the dying president had been carried. He remained there through the night, among the small group keeping vigil. When Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, William was present, one of the few black people in the room at the moment when the great emancipator passed from life. The assassination devastated William both personally and politically. He had lost a man he respected and cared for, and he had lost the president who had been most sympathetic to black rights. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, was a Southern Democrat with no commitment to black equality. The hopes for Reconstruction that had seemed so promising just days earlier now seemed endangered. In the weeks following Lincoln's death, William found himself in an unusual position. He possessed knowledge of Lincoln's thinking, of plans and intentions that Lincoln had shared in private conversations but had not yet implemented. He had insight into what Lincoln hoped to achieve in Reconstruction, yet he had no official standing to claim authority based on these conversations, and indeed, revealing them publicly would have been seen as presumptuous and inappropriate for someone of his social station. William did what he could quietly. He communicated with black leaders and Republican politicians who had supported Lincoln, sharing what he knew of the president's intentions regarding Reconstruction. He wrote letters, using his knowledge to advocate for policies he believed Lincoln would have supported. But he did so carefully, never claiming explicitly that he was conveying Lincoln's private thoughts, always maintaining the fiction that he was merely an observant servant offering his own opinions. A letter from William to Thaddeus Stevens, the radical Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, dated May 1865, illustrates this approach. Honorable Sir, I write as one who had the privilege of observing President Lincoln closely during his final years. While I cannot claim to know with certainty what he would have done regarding Reconstruction, I believe I understood something of his thinking. He recognized that emancipation must be followed by citizenship and political rights if freed people are to have real security. He understood that education would be essential. He was moving, I believe, toward more generous views on suffrage than he held at war's beginning. I hope those who shape Reconstruction policy will honor his legacy by ensuring that freedom becomes real and protected by law. William remained in Washington after Lincoln's death, continuing to work in various capacities and maintaining his activism for black rights. During the early years of Reconstruction, he worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping newly freed people navigate their new status. He advocated for civil rights legislation and for the 14th and 15th Amendments that would guarantee citizenship and voting rights. His role as Lincoln's confidential advisor remained unknown to the public. When the first major biographies of Lincoln were published in the 1870s and 1880s, William was mentioned only in passing, if at all, as part of the household staff. His intellectual contributions, his political insights, his influence on the president's thinking about slavery and race, all of this remained invisible in the historical record. William died in Washington, D.C. on January 16, 1882. At approximately 67 years old. His obituary in the Washington Evening Star was brief. William Slade, colored, For many years, a servant in the White House, and particularly during President Lincoln's administration, died yesterday. He was respected by all who knew him for his character and reliability. The obituary said nothing of his relationship with Lincoln, nothing of his role in advising the president, nothing that suggested his significance beyond being a faithful servant. The recovery of William's story began accidentally. In the 1960s, Dr. Margaret Foster was researching Lincoln's correspondence for a dissertation on his political strategy regarding border states. She noticed a series of unsigned memoranda and letters that appeared in Lincoln's files from 1861 onward. The documents were written in careful script, addressed topics related to slavery and black sentiment, and contained insights that seemed to reflect direct knowledge of black communities. Dr. Foster began investigating the authorship of these documents. Through handwriting analysis, she determined that they were written by the same person. Through contextual clues and cross-referencing with other documents, she identified that person as William Slade. She discovered the correspondence between William and Frederick Douglass, which provided confirmation that William had been advising Lincoln on matters of high importance. Dr. Foster's 1967 dissertation, Hidden Counselor, William Slade and Abraham Lincoln, presented evidence that fundamentally revised understanding of Lincoln's presidency. She demonstrated that Lincoln had relied on counsel from a black advisor whose contributions had been systematically erased from the historical record. Her work was initially controversial. Some historians questioned whether she was overstating William's importance or misinterpreting limited evidence. But as more scholars examined the sources, the consensus emerged that Dr. Foster was essentially correct. William Slade had played a significant role in advising Lincoln, particularly on matters related to slavery, emancipation, and black political participation. Subsequent research has strengthened this understanding. The discovery of additional letters and documents has provided more evidence of William's intellectual activities and his relationship with Lincoln. Historians have contextualized William's story within the broader history of black political thought and activism during the Civil War era. His story has been incorporated into Lincoln biographies and into studies of black history during Reconstruction. What emerges from this research is a portrait of a remarkable man whose intelligence, insight, and political acumen allowed him to influence history from a position that was supposed to render him powerless. William Slade was born enslaved, denied formal education, constrained by racial hierarchies throughout his life. Yet he educated himself, developed sophisticated understanding of politics and strategy, and found ways to exercise influence even when the system was designed to exclude him from power. His relationship with Lincoln was extraordinary, but not entirely unique. Throughout history, enslaved and subordinated people have found ways to influence those in power, often through the very relationships of service that were meant to maintain hierarchy. A servant who dresses a leader, who is present during private moments, who overhears sensitive conversations, who earns trust through discretion and capability. Such a person can gain access and influence that formal advisors might not possess. What made William's case unusual was the extent of his influence and the importance of the historical moment. He was not merely offering household gossip or personal observations. He was providing strategic analysis on the most consequential questions facing the nation. He was helping shape policies that would affect millions of people. He was contributing to decisions that would determine whether slavery ended, whether black people gained citizenship and rights, whether the United States would move toward racial justice or would maintain white supremacy. The fact that his role remained hidden during his lifetime, and for more than a century after his death, reflects the racial dynamics of American society. A black man advising a white president on matters of race and slavery violated fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy. It could not be openly acknowledged without challenging the ideological foundations of white supremacy. Therefore, it had to be kept secret, even from most of Lincoln's inner circle, and certainly from the public. This secrecy meant that William received no credit during his life for his contributions. He died largely unknown, his achievements unrecognized. He could not leverage his role to gain position or wealth. He could not write memoirs or give public speeches about his experiences. He had to maintain the fiction that he was merely a servant, even though he had been much more. The recovery of his story raises important questions about historical memory and whose contributions are recognized. How many other people like William Slade existed? People who made significant contributions but who were erased from history because of their race, class, or gender. How much of the history we think we know is incomplete because the contributions of subordinated people went unrecorded or were deliberately concealed? William's story also complicates our understanding of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is rightly celebrated as the great emancipator, the president who ended slavery and who gave his life for the cause of union and freedom. But understanding that he relied on counsel from a black advisor adds nuance to this picture. It suggests that Lincoln's evolution on racial issues was influenced by direct engagement with black political thought, that his policies reflected not just his own moral reasoning, but also insights and arguments from black thinkers like William Slade. This does not diminish Lincoln's achievement. He still had to make the decisions, to exercise power, to lead the nation through crisis. But it acknowledges that he did not do so in isolation, that he listened to voices that most white leaders of his era ignored, and that his greatness included the wisdom to seek counsel from those who had lived experience of the systems he was trying to dismantle. For Black Americans, William's story is part of a larger narrative of intellectual achievement and political activism that has often been rendered invisible. From the colonial period through slavery and segregation to the present, black thinkers, writers, activists, and leaders have contributed to American political and intellectual life. Many of these contributions were unacknowledged at the time and have been forgotten since. Recovering stories like William's helps restore a fuller, more accurate understanding of black people's role in shaping American history. The story's title, "The Slave Who Became the President's Secret Advisor," captures the remarkable trajectory of William's life, though it requires one clarification. William was not enslaved when he became Lincoln's advisor. He had been freed more than 3 decades before Lincoln's presidency. The title is accurate in noting his origins in slavery and the fact that his advisory role remained secret, but it should not obscure the fact that he spent most of his adult life as a free man who actively shaped his own destiny and who chose to use his abilities in service of his people's liberation. What William's story demonstrates is that intelligence, capability, and political insight are not determined by race or formal credentials, but emerge from experience, observation, and individual capacity. William had no formal education, no official training in politics or strategy. What he had was intelligence, life experience that gave him unique perspectives, careful observation of political dynamics over many years, and the wisdom to offer his insights effectively when opportunity arose. His story also demonstrates the courage required to claim influence from a position of supposed powerlessness. Every time William offered his opinion to the president, he risked rebuff, dismissal, or punishment. The social norms of the era dictated that black people should not presume to advise white people, especially not the president. By persistently offering his counsel, by insisting that his perspective had value, William challenged these norms and created space for his voice to be heard. The political impact of William's influence is difficult to measure precisely. We cannot know how much his counsel affected specific decisions Lincoln made. But we can say with confidence that Lincoln's policies regarding emancipation, black military service, and black suffrage reflected understanding of black communities and black political thought that Lincoln gained at least partly through his conversations with William Slade. The Emancipation Proclamation, the recruitment of black troops, the beginning of support for black suffrage, these were transformative policies that changed American history. If William Slade contributed even marginally to these developments, then his influence was significant, and the evidence suggests his contribution was more than marginal, that he was a consistent voice in Lincoln's ear, advocating for black rights and helping Lincoln understand the perspectives of black Americans. William's story is ultimately about the persistence of human dignity and intelligence despite systematic oppression. He was born into a system designed to dehumanize him, to deny his intellectual capacity, to restrict him to manual labor and service. He refused to accept these limitations. He educated himself when education was denied. He developed political sophistication despite exclusion from formal politics. He found ways to exercise influence despite being relegated to subordinate positions. His success in doing so should not be taken to mean that the system was not as oppressive as it seems, or that individual achievement could overcome systemic barriers. William was exceptional, and his story was unusual. Most enslaved people never gained freedom. Most free black people never gained access to powerful white leaders. Most voices were never heard. William's achievement highlights, rather than diminishes, the injustice of a system that wasted the talents and crushed the aspirations of millions. In remembering William Slade, we honor not just one man, but all those who resisted oppression through whatever means were available to them, who maintained their humanity and dignity despite systematic dehumanization, who contributed to their communities and to history even when their contributions went unrecognized. We acknowledge the long tradition of black political thought and activism that existed even in the darkest periods of slavery and segregation. And we commit to ensuring that future generations will have opportunities that William was denied, to develop their talents openly, to contribute their insights publicly, to be recognized and celebrated for their achievements. If this narrative has moved you to reflection about hidden histories, about the contributions of those rendered invisible by systems of power, and about the complex relationship between individual agency and systemic oppression, I invite you to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments about what William's story means to you, and subscribe to this channel for more accounts that recover forgotten voices from American history and honor those who influenced the course of events, from positions that were supposed to render them powerless.